আপনাদের সকলকে আমি আবারও আমন্ত্রণ জানাচ্ছি আজকের ক্রিমিনাল লয়ের উপর এই আইন বিষয়ক অনুষ্ঠান ক্রিমিনাল জাস্টিস প্রোগ্রাম দেখবার জন্য। আমি আজাম এন্ড কো সলিসিটার্স এর প্রিন্সিপাল সলিসিটর শাফিউল আজম। আমরা আজকে অত্যন্ত গুরুত্বপূর্ণ প্রেস্টন ক্রাউন কোর্টের জাজ আপনার একটা স্পিচ দিচ্ছে এবং এই স্পিচের মধ্যে আপনার যে একটা মেয়েকে অনেক বছরের সাজা দিয়েছে ওইটা সে বলছে। সে আপনার এশিয়ান গ্রুমিং গ্যাংদের এগেনস্টে রেপ এলিগেশন, সেক্সুয়াল অ্যাসল্ট, তাকে অ্যাবিউজ করেছে, এই এলিগেশনগুলো করেছে। এগুলো সব ডাহা মিথ্যা, একটাও সত্য ছিল না। এবং এই মিথ্যা কথা বলার জন্য তাকে অনেক বছরের সাজা দিয়েছিল। তার বয়স ছিল তখন 22 বছর। আর যারা ভিকটিম ছিল এই কেসের ওরা এশিয়ান, ওরা নাম প্রকাশ করতে ইচ্ছুক ছিল না, যার জন্য জাজ তাদের নাম এখানে বলছে না। এটা আপনার তাদের জন্য একটা রেপুটেশনের ব্যাপার স্যাপার আছে, যার জন্য এটা তারা নাম প্রকাশ করতে ইচ্ছা করে নাই। কেউ বলছে এটা নাম প্রকাশ না করার জন্য। আমরা আবার আমরা জানুয়ারি মাসে এই ক্রাউন কোর্টের জাজ তাকে এই সাজা দিয়েছিল ফর পারভার্টিং দ্য কোর্স অফ জাস্টিস, যে সে একটা পারভার্ট করার জন্য বিচার ব্যবস্থাকে, এটার জন্য পারভার্টিং দ্য কোর্স অফ জাস্টিসের জন্য তাকে সাজা দিয়েছিল। আর প্রেস্টন ক্রাউন কোর্টের জাজ ছিল আপনার রবার্ট আলথাম। সে বলছে কি, ইট ইজ ট্রাভেলিং টু সে দ্য লিস্ট দ্যাট শি শোজ নো সিগনিফিক্যান্ট সাইনস অফ রিমোর্স। এবং এটা খুবই দুঃখজনক যে এটা খুবই সত্য যে কোনো বেশি একটা সিগনিফিক্যান্ট কোনো রিমোর্স, যে অনুশোচনা তাকে যে করতে হবে, অনুশোচনা সে দেখায় নাই। একটা সিগনিফিক্যান্ট একটা রিমোর্স করা, এইটা সে দেখায় নাই। তারপর সে আরো বলছে কি, there was no explanation for why the defendant made the allegations which he described as complete fiction. এবং সে বলছে কি, কেন এই এলিগেশনগুলো করেছিল এটা কোনো এক্সপ্লেনেশন নাই। এই মেয়েটা কেন এই এলিগেশনগুলো করেছিল, এবং সে এগুলোকে বলছিল কি একটা কমপ্লিট ফিকশন, একটা মিথ্যা গল্প। ফিকশন হইলো কি বুঝেন তো, ফিকশনের মতো একটা মিথ্যা গল্পের মতো এগুলা সে বলছিল, কারণ তার এই মিথ্যা কথা বলার তার কোনো এক্সপ্লেনেশন ছিল না। আমি এই ভিডিওটা আবার প্লে করার জন্য বলছি কন্ট্রোল রুমকে, প্লিজ আপনারা ভিডিওটা কন্টিনিউ করেন।
And cultivated a friendship with him to create messages she could later use. Another was a vague school acquaintance who wanted a relationship with her. He was renamed to Haram or Rami. She then took screenshots of these messages, falsely appearing to come from Haram or Rami, so that she could say they were evidence of her being trafficked. The defendant manipulated friends and work colleagues to involve them unwittingly in her deceptions. She invented people in her phone who simply didn't exist. She sometimes used two phones, one to send and one to receive messages from supposed traffickers or trafficked women. She would then take screenshots of those messages. There were other types of message she created. She would inflict unpleasant injuries on herself, which she later attributed to fictitious traffickers. She wrote letters to herself, supposedly from Rami. She made false diary entries. Based upon the evidence I have heard, I'm sure of all of the matters which I've set out above. It follows that in relation to count 5, she is to be sentenced on the basis of all of the particulars under paragraph A and paragraph B. I turn to count 6. Whilst the defendant had refused to participate in a witness protection programme, she did agree to be temporarily housed by the police in a hotel close to Kendal police station. The police arranged for her to have a job there. These events happened during the time frame of count 5. However, because the issue was completely different to the remainder of count 5, it was reflected in a separate count. It's convenient to deal with it at this stage. On the 30th of June 2019, the defendant left the hotel provided by the police and travelled to Blackpool by train. She'd already booked herself a hotel room there. The undisputed evidence was that she checked into her room and spent most of her time there. When she did go out, she was alone and on foot. She was seen on video to make a note of on her phone of the vehicle registration number of a car and the details of a takeaway restaurant. Having done so, she went to a shop, bought some food, sat in her hotel room and watched YouTube videos. The next day, she got up late and made her way to Preston. The police and her family were worried about her. She had ignored their messages. Eventually, police officers traced her to Preston and met her there. She was driven home to Barrow-in-Furness, and in the early hours of the morning, Detective Inspector Nutter came to meet her, worried as to what had happened. The defendant was later to tell the police in great detail that the traffickers had found her in Kendal and instructed her to go to Blackpool. There, she said, she was met by Mr. Ramzan and threatened with a violent death. She was made to visit 4 premises, and at each she was brutally raped by multiple men. The car whose registration number she had noted down was, she said, used to transport her between properties. A flat above the takeaway, whose details she had noted down, was for the venue for one of these attacks. Officers took her to Blackpool twice to try and identify the locations of these places. This account was all completely false. Eventually, confronted by incontrovertible evidence, she was forced to accept that none of this was true. She was later to claim at trial that she was forced to give this false account by the traffickers, but I ruled that duress was not available to her. Indeed, I am sure that no one pressured her to go to Blackpool at all. She did so entirely of her own volition in order to make up false allegations against Mr. Ramzan and others. I turn to count 7. On the 18th of July 2019, the defendant caught a train to Leeds. The clear evidence is that she spent a good part of the day in the park. She had 2 phones with her. She then travelled back to Preston, where she walked into the town centre. A young man walking home from a family party happened upon her. He asked her for a light, and they started to talk. They had a brief and entirely consensual sexual encounter. The defendant then caught the train to Barrow-in-Furness, exchanging details with the young man and tentatively agreeing to meet him at a later date. Once in Barrow-in-Furness, she walked to her flat. Her brother's girlfriend happened to see her as she walked her home, picked her up and took her home. Much of this, including much of what happened in Preston, was caught on closed-circuit television. By now it was the early hours of the 19th of July. Once her brother learned from his girlfriend that the defendant was at home, he called the police. Everyone had been frantically worried about her all day, and she had been ignoring their messages. When the police arrived at her house, the defendant pretended to be semi-conscious. The jury and I saw body-worn footage captured by the officers. It's clear that the defendant was play-acting, pretending to be semi-conscious. She was injured, but the clear evidence was that she had inflicted the injuries upon herself. She then created a false account of what had happened in Leeds, Preston and Barrow that day. All of this account was inconsistent with CCTV, telephone and other evidence. She told the police that on Wednesday the 17th of July, a man called Salza, an invented trafficker, came to her door. He'd slapped her in the face, pinned her to the wall by the neck. He told her to follow orders she would get on Snapchat. He said that she had lost them money and she needed to earn them £10,000 as a result. She said that she was then told to go to Leeds. There she was taken to a house where she had sex with 2 men. She and a girl called Molly then walked to another premises. There were other girls there. There she said she had sex with 3 men. She was then driven to a chicken shop in Headingley, where she had sex with another man. She then said she was driven to Bramley and then to Bradford, where she had sex with 3 men. She then saw her passport on the table with a ring on it and flight details to Bangladesh, so she ran. When the traffickers were able to contact her by phone, she was told to go to Preston. She said that the young man she had met in Preston was a trafficker and that he had sent her a message telling her that he had lined up some cocaine on a bench and she had no choice but to take it. She said that he took her to 2 Asian men who paid him to have sex with her. She then said that the young man himself then took her down a back alley and raped her. Eventually, she said, she was allowed to return to Barrow-in-Furness. Salza met her at the train station and he drove her home. We have seen the video footage of her walking home. She said that when she opened her door, he and another man forced their way in and she was forced to have sex with them both. Salza struck her in the face and told her to sort herself out and that they would be back for her at 2 a.m. 10 minutes later, the police arrived and she could not recall anything further until she woke in hospital. This was a complete fabrication. Much of it could be disproved from CCTV in Preston and Barrow-in-Furness. What happened in Leeds was shown to be false by the location of her phone. She had, during the course of the day, created other evidence to support the false account she knew she would give. Most notably, she had used one of the 2 phones she had with her that day to send messages from a person she described as Nicole to herself. She'd then taken screenshots of those messages. Nicole was supposed to be a fellow trafficked woman who was being raped at the parties. Nicole was supposedly angry at the defendant for leaving her and the other victims in Leeds. However, the agreed evidence was that when Nicole was apparently complaining about being left in Leeds by the defendant, the phone from which the messages were being sent was with the defendant on the train back to Preston. She was sending the Nicole messages from one phone in her possession to the other phone in her possession. I turn now to count 8. In May 2020, the defendant was on bail for perverting the course of justice. It's clear that she was still intent on trying to invent evidence to support her previous accounts. In the earlier part of 2020, the instances of her apparently going missing and turning up intoxicated and injured had increased. On the 18th of May 2020, she set out from home on foot. It's clear from the evidence that she never left Walney Island and never entered a vehicle. At 22:49, she was found by police in fields close to her home. She had multiple injuries. One eye was swollen shut. She had hammer injuries to her legs and abdomen, which were too numerous to count. Part of her little finger was partly severed. These injuries were all self-inflicted. Her account was that she had intended to catch a bus to travel to Barrow, but one of the males associated with those who'd exploited her offered her a lift, which she accepted. She then said that she was taken to a house in Barrow-in-Furness. There were 10 males there. She said that a number of named men raped her at that property. One of them assaulted her and tried to cut her finger off. One of them drove her back to Walney Island. She walked off to where the police found her. A few days later, the police found a hammer, which she had purchased some days before. It was hidden against a fence close to where the police had found her. It bore traces of her blood and DNA. A Home Office pathologist gave evidence to the effect that the serious injuries she had sustained were completely inconsistent with her account and completely consistent with being self-inflicted with the hammer which she had bought, which was found close to her and which bore her DNA. On the 20th of May 2019, the defendant made a Facebook post in which she posted shocking photographs of the injuries she had inflicted upon herself. These photographs were very graphic and bound to produce a significant response. In that post, she referred to these having been inflicted by 3 as she put it, Asian men as they took her to various sex parties. In that same post, she referred to having been similarly abused by Asian men and men of Pakistani origin in various locations across the north of England for a number of years. She said that she would continue to tell the police everything she knew. She encouraged parents to be vigilant and children to speak out if they were concerned. She did not mention that she was already on bail for perverting the course of justice. I turn to count 9, to which the defendant pleaded guilty. This admission represents her writing a letter from custody to her sister, asking her sister to tell her, that is the defendant's solicitors, that a hammer had been found in her bedroom. This was an attempt to create a false defence to count 8. When she entered her plea, it was on the basis only of what she wrote to her sister and not what was said to her mother. In the context of this case, it is not necessary to decide that issue, and I will sentence her on her basis. The defendant is 22. She had no convictions prior to these matters coming before the court. I note that she was under 18 at the time of the commission of count 1. She had turned 18 by the time all other offences were committed, but I bear in mind her young age and the principles set out in the guideline in relation to sentencing children and young people. Though she was an adult at the time of the commission of the vast majority of this offending, I must bear in mind her maturity as well as her chronological age. There is evidence that she is immature. Apart from her age, there is some other personal mitigation. There are clear overtones of difficulties in her childhood. She's been self-harming from a young age. However, there is little clarity about what these difficulties involved. It is mitigation that before this offending she was of good character. It is troubling to say the least that she shows no significant sign of remorse, even continuing to profess the truth of her allegations. The only flicker of appreciation of what she has done came today, with a brief note read by her counsel regretting the effects of her post on the 20th of May 2020. I've received much psychiatric evidence in this case, all of which I've read. I heard evidence yesterday from Dr. Bacon called on behalf of the defendant. Dr. Bacon maintains that the defendant has a complex post-traumatic stress disorder. Dr. Locke, who has provided a report for the Crown, does not accept that this is a conclusion which can be drawn, given that there is no satisfactory account of any antecedent trauma. I agree with the conclusion of Dr. Locke.
দর্শক, আপনারা শুনছেন প্রেস্টন ক্রাউন কোর্টের জাজ স্পিচ দিচ্ছিল, অনেক লম্বা সাজা দিয়েছে এই মেয়েটাকে। তার বয়স যখন 18 বছর হয়েছিল তখন থেকে সেই এই সেক্সুয়াল এলিগেশনগুলো করতেছিল পুলিশের কাছে, যে তাকে রেপ করেছে, সেক্সুয়াল অ্যাসল্ট করেছে। সে নিজেকে নিজে তার চোখগুলো সোয়ালেন করেছিল আঘাত করে, তার ব্রুজিং করেছিল হ্যামার দিয়ে, এবং অনেকগুলো ক্ষতবিক্ষত আপনার পুলিশের চিহ্নগুলা তারা দেখাইছে, যে বোঝানোর জন্য যে তাকে অনেকভাবে তাকে মানে অ্যাবিউজ করা হচ্ছিল, তাকে সেক্সুয়াল এক্সপ্লয়টেশনের জন্য। এবং বলছে কি তাকে আমস্টারডামে নেওয়া হয়েছিল, আসলে তাকে ওখানে নিলেও সে রুমের বাইরে ছিল না। তার বোন এবং বোনের জামাই তারা সবসময় তার উপর নজর রাখছিল, তারাও এই কথা বলছে। এবং একের পর এক অনেকগুলো মিথ্যা অভিযোগ, রেপের, সেক্সুয়াল অ্যাসল্টের অভিযোগ সে পুলিশের কাছে করেছে। এবং প্রেস্টন ক্রাউন কোর্টের জাজ একটার পর একটা অনেকগুলো তার অভিযোগগুলো বলে যাচ্ছিল এবং বলতেছিল যে এগুলো একটা ফিকশনের মতো, এটা একটা কমপ্লিট ফিকশন। সে জাজ বলছে কি এটা একটা মিথ্যা গল্প। এবং জাজ বলছে কি unless and until the defendant chose to say why she has told these lies, we will not know. যতক্ষণ পর্যন্ত মেয়েটা নিজের থেকে বলবে না কেন সে এই মিথ্যাচারগুলো করেছে কেন সে এই মিথ্যা অপবাদগুলো মানে এই এশিয়ান ম্যানদের অ্যাগেইনস্টে করেছে পুলিশের কাছে, যাদের লাইফটা তারা সে হেল করে দিয়েছে। ওরা সোসাইটির থেকে বিচ্ছিন্ন হয়ে গিয়েছিল, লজ্জায় তাদের রেপুটেশনের মানে একটা আঘাত, এবং তারা তাদের রেপুটেশন, তাদের বিজনেস, তাদের ফ্যামিলি লাইফ, পার্সোনাল লাইফ এই মেয়েটা রুইন করে দিয়েছিল। এবং তারা নাম প্রকাশ করতে ইচ্ছুক ছিল না, তারা নাম বলে নাই, এবং পুলিশ এগুলো অনেক তদন্ত করেছে, এবং তদন্ত করার পর জাজ তাকে পারভার্টিং দ্য কোর্স অফ জাস্টিস, আপনার সে বিচার ব্যবস্থাটাকে একটা করার জন্য, পারভার্ট করার জন্য তাকে জাজ সাজা দিয়েছিল। এবং জাজ বলছে কি, যতক্ষণ পর্যন্ত সে বলবে না নিজের থেকে কেন সে মিথ্যাচারগুলো করেছিল, এটা বুঝা সম্ভব না। তারপর সে যখন সাজা দিয়েছিল, জাজের দিকে সে স্ট্রেইট অ্যাহেড সে দেখছিল, and thanked the judge after he sentenced her, এবং জাজকে সে ধন্যবাদ দিয়েছিল, থ্যাংক ইউ থ্যাংক করেছিল জাজের দিকে দেখে তাকে এই সাজা দেওয়ার পরে। In statement read to the court on Monday, ওই যে অনেক বছর আগে এটা, 3 of the men Williams had accused described attempt to take their own life following her allegations. এই মেয়েটা এই মিথ্যা অপবাদগুলো করার পরে, এই লোকগুলোর বিরুদ্ধে এই সেক্সুয়াল অ্যাসল্টের অ্যালিগেশনগুলো, রেপের অ্যালিগেশনগুলো করার পরে 3 জন ব্যক্তি তারা নিজেদেরকে আত্মহত্যা করতে চেয়েছিল। তারা নিজের লাইফটাকে, এত তাদের রেপুটেশনের উপর আঘাত আসছিল, তারা নিজেদেরকে নিজেরা হত্যা করতে চেষ্টা করেছিল। এটা খুবই লোমহর্ষকর ঘটনা। এই ধরনের ঘটনাগুলো হচ্ছে, সবাইকে কেয়ারফুল থাকতে হবে, সজাগ থাকতে হবে। আমরাও সজাগ আছি। আর এই জাজের স্পিচটা আমরা নেক্সট সেগমেন্টে আমরা আরো কন্টিনিউ করবো, আরো বাকি অংশটুকু। আমি শর্ট একটা ব্রেকে যাচ্ছি, ব্রেকের পরে আমি আবার ফিরে আসব। আমি আজাম এন্ড কো সলিসিটার্স এর প্রিন্সিপাল সলিসিটর শাফিউল আজম, সবাই আমার সাথেই থাকুন। আপনারা জাজের বাকি স্পিচটা শুনবেন নেক্সট সেগমেন্টের মধ্যে।